Hey everybody, it's Dr. Erin here, and I am jumping in with a real quick announcement before we start our 101 video. In our attempts to practice authentic and inclusive representation, we have decided to do a form of a land acknowledgement before this video. From our research, we have learned that it is standard practice in Australia, and we want to respect that practice. However, land acknowledgements within Indigenous people groups are as fraught as any element of colonization. No cultural group is a monolith, and we know that for many Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements coming from non-Indigenous peoples are not always welcome or encouraged. In doing our best to be respectful and to practice mindful decolonization, we're going to make mistakes. We've done it so many times on Colonizer's World Tour, and we're going to do it again. But we felt really strongly that it was important to include this acknowledgement for this video. In the spirit of reconciliation, Abbey Research acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We are grateful for those who share their experiences, beliefs, histories, and lives with us so that we have the opportunity to learn, grow, and build empathy.
Everybody, we are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
You are exceptionally welcome to our little corner of the internet, where this video is going to be talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as part of our series, The Colonizer's World Tour, which we're at the end of season 2, book 2 now, and we've talked about so many places, all with the premise that colonization is not necessarily something that happened. It is something that is happening and is something we need to be much more curious and investigative about as a people on the planet. And this particular month here in the month of October of 2022, we're going to be talking about various Indigenous peoples. First, we're hang out here in Australia. We'll also be covering the Indigenous peoples of Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii. And we are on steep learning curves for all of them, for sure. And we know, we're going to say this at the beginning of every single video, we know we're going to mispronounce things. We know we're going to only be scratching the surface. We are going to be doing our best because we are deeply curious about these things. We have learned so much, and we believe that you, as our viewers, should learn a lot as well. If you are in the people groups included in any of these broad umbrella nations, we would love to hear from you and learn from you. We are researchers at heart for sure, so I'm very proud of our Google skills, but they are limited, of course, especially because we don't reside in any of the geographical locations that we're speaking about this month. Trust me, even just wrapping my brain around the map of Australia took me a hot minute this month. So we are babies in this conversation, but we hope that some of the patterns that we can observe as social scientists that connect to the rest of the patterns of colonization around the planet can help us all understand each other just a little bit better. With that introduction, my dear best friend Erin, what did you know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people before you started this research?
Yeah, I vaguely remember watching a movie that had a plot point where there was a light-skinned Aboriginal child who was taken. I have no idea what movie it was. I vaguely like recall details of it, but I had no like grasping of its reality or like the scale of the stolen generation or any of that. I've read a few articles, but like basically nothing. And so, I want to reiterate kind of the caveat that you made, that we see these as the beginning of conversations. We see these videos and these explorations as the beginnings of conversations. They're certainly the beginnings of our research and our attempts to understand all of the variety of humans that encompass Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we're at the start of a very steep hill. Yeah. As I was researching, I was like, okay, I knew nothing. Basically nothing. How about yourself?
Yeah, I saw the movie Australia. I don't remember it. And I have listened to true crime podcasts about Australia and various crimes that have taken place in Australia. And I remember when the Australian government apologized to the Aboriginal people.
Right.
Like, I have a conscious memory of that. And then I have some Australian friends that have talked about how much they loathe how the government handles Aboriginal folks. I am not personal friends with anybody who has ever disclosed to me that they are Aboriginal. So it's all been, settler descended, colonizer descended people, as far as I know, that have said those kind of things. Yeah, like, really, really going deep here. Like, Hugh Jackman is my entry point into Australia until we got the Hemsworth brothers. So,
right.
I mean, we have a lot of work to do for sure. So, I mean, let's go to the map. You probably know, but just in case you don't, Australia is a continent between the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean. But you probably don't know where the Torres Strait Islands are, because we didn't until this started, and they are at the top of Australia. The people there come from the islands between northeastern Queensland and Papua New Guinea, and originate from Melanesia and the Western Pacific. So in terms of the entirety of Australia and Torres Strait Island, most Aboriginal folks do live in the north, south, and central regions of Australia. And if you watch a couple of videos about the history of the colonization of Australia, you'll know that most of the colonizers settled their settlements and their battlements in the south. And so that's a huge part of why. And 22% of northern Australia is Aboriginal owned, which I think is a scathing indictment on the United States, that I thought that percentage was very high.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, that's high.
They own 22% of their own land.
But like I said, scathing indictment on the U.S.
Yeah.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 3.3% of the nation's population. Let me pause right here, and just in case Dr. Aaron isn't going to get into this, you will hear a lot of various videos made until about 3-4 years ago use the word Aborigines as to describe the Aboriginal people. It is now commonly understood that that is not the word we use. That is slightly derivative, it carries a lot of baggage from when they were not spoken about with respect at all. I have not uncovered any evidence that it is the same as, like, say, the N word, but it might be, and we might not know that. I didn't see anything. That doesn't mean it's not true. But I have heard a lot of people in the United States use that word still. So wanted to highlight that now, that is not a word that we use. We use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I am aware it is more words. Good news, your tongue just gets a workout. So they make up about 3.3% of the Australian population. And according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which, let me tell you, my kingdom for a United States Board of Statistics with this level of...
So much stuff. They have so much stuff.
It's incredible. As researchers, I'm like, okay. So there's around 880,000 Aboriginal people registered to where they could get to those statistics. So the cities, New South Wales and Queensland, are the two biggest cities in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks live. Now, languages. Guys. Aaron's going to get into this, but they are the oldest peoples on the planet with a continuous thing.
Culture.
So you can imagine the language. Thank you, culture. My gosh, I think I was going with legacy, and that's not the word I wanted at all. So thank you. So if they've been around since like literally God was a boy, you can imagine that there's lots of languages. Even after colonization, and so many of their languages have been destroyed, there are 150 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages spoken in 2016, which brought me so much joy. Like, that there was still that many. I was so happy. And there are around 60,000 speakers. There was a really great video in the downstairs from a Aboriginal elder named, oh my gosh, they're all auntie is how you refer to folks. But it's a really great, very calm explanation of everything, and talks about how there are still a really drought of speakers. Let me scroll down and get her name. Excuse me.
Helen Benads by...
Thank you.
Yeah, Auntie Helen Benads.
Okay, so it's in the downstairs. I recommend that one super highly, guys.
That's one of the best ones we had.
It's a real strong overview, and she's a very articulate, and her physical voice is easy to listen to, which is wonderful because these concepts are brand new to most of us. So it's that's really, really helpful. But she talked about like that they're really struggling to teach some of the youth the languages to keep them alive. And that just... So of this ethnic and indigenous, like, oh my gosh, how do we even talk about ethnicities of so many nations? So, broad strokes here. 91% of the folks that we're referring to in these broad categories identify as Aboriginal, 4.2% as Torres Strait Islander, and around 4.4% as both. Again, this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Statistics only ever tell one piece of a story, so this is just some numbers. There are around more than 400 distinct Australian Aboriginal peoples have been identified. They distinguish their names by designated ancestral languages, speech patterns, things as such. The way that non-Aboriginal scholars have attempted to study Aboriginal culture has been varied. Some of it has been respectful. Some of it has been less so. And so whenever you are reading... One of the things that Auntie Helen mentioned in her video is that there's literally different words they use with outsiders and insiders, and not just non-Aboriginal people, but inside and outside their own nation, and inside and outside their, like, it's a very complex linguistic structure. And so whenever you are reading or learning about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks from anybody who is not of the nations themselves, of the groups themselves, always realize that it is an approximation. It is like we see through a glass darkly. There's a ton of things we just don't understand. And we're just, all of us are just doing our best.
And one of the things that I think while you're talking about this is so important to recognize, there's a great TEDx in the downstairs in the show notes as well. And I'm scrolling to see if I can find it. That's about, it is what Aboriginal knowledge can teach us about happiness by Sheree Kearney. And Sheree is not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. She's a white Australian, but she worked with them a lot. And she does a great job of explaining the damage that we do as white outsiders in trying to apply our categories of understanding to Indigenous people groups. And so we keep trying to fit them into our box of understanding. And that just doesn't work because they have different cultures, different perspectives, worldviews, ways of thinking about spirituality and family and all this kind of stuff. So for me, that was such a helpful articulation where she was like, we just keep applying the wrong category. And like, you know, if we keep measuring them by our standards, they're never going to meet up because they don't have the same standards. They don't have the same emphasis on a lot of the things that we consider to be markers of quote unquote culture or advancement or whatever. So I think that's really important to like, we keep trying to categorize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a way that is, racist and trying to be helpful and runs the spectrum. But I think we're just trying to kind of start the conversation by like some of the information that we found, but it's really hard to categorize people that don't need or want to be categorized by white Western folks.
Completely. Which we're going to get to in the art we cover tomorrow a little bit about that tension of how do we categorize in order to help and make any level of restitution and how do we handle all that. It's going to be a messy conversation, but this is a great time for me to talk really briefly about religion.
Yes,
so
please.
The spiritual and faith practices of Aboriginal folks are as varied as Aboriginal folks themselves and Torres Strait Islander folks themselves. It is not uncommon for people to practice a form of Western Christianity and various Aboriginal practices. There are forms. I've watched some videos and read some articles from Anglican pastors in New South Wales that essentially say, like, I'm going to use the liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer, but everything else is going to look very Aboriginal because it has become very syncretized. There's other parts where people keep them very separate. They go to a very Western church and then practice ancestral worship at home. It's all very varied. The broadest of strokes, it is a deified religion. There are gods. There is an understanding, religious system, faith system. There are understandings of supernatural and higher and eternal beings outside of humanity. There are 3 general categories of beings that I want to talk about because this from the religious scholars I read and the Aboriginal folks themselves that I watched videos of that explain this, these are kind of common across a lot of the practices of the peoples on this plot of land, is that there was a creation figure or creation beings, that this is a separate category of entities from anything else. Many are involved in the creation of people, landscape, environment. There's also gods that have created specific pigments. So creation, beings, and figures, that is a category. Another category is ancestral. This is a major, intense thing. They're regarded as the direct ancestors of people living today. I read some places that this is one of the reasons that people do not like to mention the name of or see images or hear voices from people who have deceased, because then you are interacting with somebody else's deity. I read that in other places that's not applied. So, grain of salt, it is very true for some people, not universally so. These ancestor deities, however, no longer appear in human form. Again, read some people that say that this is one of a theory, is that this is actually one of the origins of people talking about, like, my grandmother's, whenever I see a robin, I know my grandmother is talking to me, that this is kind of something we took from Aboriginal people because they have a much more direct and actual spiritual connection to that, like, my grandmother has come back as a robin, and whenever I see a robin, it's not that it's that she sent, it's that it is actually my grandmother. So that's some theory that's where Western folks get that conversation from. The final is a totemic ancestor, and I've never seen a group of deities or totemic beings in another faith system like these. So that's why I wanted to bring them up. The totemic being was like the original form of something as it was created. So it's I think, guys, I've had trouble wrapping my brain around it because, like I said, I've never encountered this before. But I'm reading from aboriginalculture.com.au that says that it represents the original form of an animal, plant, or other, which can be a totem, as it was in the creation period, because the creation period has ended. The concept of a totemic being overlaps with a creation being and an ancestral being, because the totemic being creates an abundance of species, and people see themselves as being derived from different totemic beings, but they were created by the created beings. So it's like some people believe that the creator directly created humans, and some people believe that they created something else that people then evolved from. So the totems, the way that they articulate totems is not even something I've seen in North American indigenous populations as much. They articulate the totems a little bit differently. So that's religion. Again, a reminder that this is not, that the settler religion was Protestantism, first with the Dutch and then with the English. And that while there are certainly Catholics on the island, they say about 22% of people that practice Christianity among the Aboriginal people practice it. Among Australians, about 22% are Catholic. And we think that's around the same in the Aboriginal population. Like, no one really knows. But again, Christian scholar here. Christianity looks different everywhere you go because that's part of the point of it. So part of the point of it is that it's supposed to look like who is worshiping and who is practicing. It's supposed to take on new practices. It's supposed to take on new things. And so in a way, my sociology of religion self is the most excited by people that have added totemic beings into the liturgy of Christianity, because I don't see them as exclusive at all, as mutually exclusive. So it's faith is evolutionary. Religion is evolutionary. Last final thought. You may read some places in which you'll hear scholars say that Aboriginal belief systems are not religions because they are not institutionalized. That is not in any way, shape, or form a degradation of their, or like a dissing of their faith system. It is that a lot of scholars believe that in order to call something a religion, it has to be institutionalized. So I'm more comfortable calling this a set of beliefs, a deified set of beliefs, than a religion, for sure. But just a heads up on that. So that's my soapbox. I will step aside. So now Erin can tell us a little bit more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander demographics.
Yeah, and I think too, it's I saw a couple of interviews with Aboriginal folks talking about aspects of their faith practice or their cultural practices, and one Aboriginal elder made the point that they don't owe us their stories. They don't owe us explanations for these things that we might be curious about. So there's a lot we don't know about their kind of faiths, their spiritual based practices, and that's okay, because they don't owe us that, especially with the legacy of a Christian-based colonization, and especially, as I'll get into, with a lot of human rights violations that happened on the basis of converting Aboriginal folks to Christianity. So it's always good to just keep making that reminder as we go through these discussions of Aboriginal peoples as sensitively as we can. Demographics, there's not a lot of information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that I wanted to discuss in demographics, because it plays out more so in the human rights category. But the median age for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is 24, which is compared to 38 for non-Indigenous Australians. So a very big gap there. There also only 5.4% of Indigenous Australians are aged 65 and over, compared with 17% of non-Indigenous Australians. So what does that tell us? It tells us that they're a very young population, and that for a lot of reasons they do not live to older age. And a lot of those reasons fall into the human rights category. So let's just go straight to there. There is currently no reference to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the National Constitution of Australia.
That was like a record scratch moment for both of us. I know.
I feel like if you wanna, I feel like that's the tip of the iceberg of the human rights. Like, if you wanna understand, too long didn't read. There's no reference to them in the Constitution. And so, racism, folks, colonialism, settler colonialism, explains so much of this. Racial discrimination became illegal in Australia in 1976, but that hasn't protected Indigenous people from still suffering a lot of socio-economic, demographic inequities, including in terms of health, education, unemployment, incarceration, all of these things. Today, Australia's Indigenous kids are 24 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous classmates. It is like the most over-incarcerated population I have ever heard about, more so than Black male Americans in the United States, which is an exceptionally over-incarcerated population. It's really important to recognize that younger generations have inherited their relatives' deep trauma and anger from losing their lands, their cultures, and their families. The Australian government has had a history of policies that take away Aboriginal people's basic rights, such as the Northern Territory intervention, and forced Indigenous peoples to abandon their homes and communities. All of the statistics when we talk about very, very highly marginalized and oppressed groups, they have higher rates of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, higher uses of alcohol and drug abuse, and higher rates of discrimination than any other group. So brother boys, sister girls, and other LGBT, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples experience a number of significant and intersecting points of discrimination and marginalization in Australia. And one of the largest problems I think they're facing is this overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. So while Indigenous Australians make up less than 3%, well, just over 3% of the population, they represent more than a quarter of adult prisoners. More than half the children sentenced to juvenile detention in Australia are Aboriginal. We'll talk about this tomorrow when we talk about our piece of art as well. An Indigenous teenage boy in Australia is more likely to go to jail than university. And Roxanne Moore, who's an executive director for the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, was quoted in one of the articles we used as our resources by saying the over-incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today is a direct legacy of colonialism in Australia. Massacres and the jailing of Indigenous Australians enabled British settlement in Australia from the late 18th century. Police have played a huge role in forcing people off their land and enforcing other policies, including the stolen generation, which if you don't know this term, there's a lot of stuff in the show notes about it, but it was a policy directed by the Australian government, supported by the police state in Australia, that was the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families. From the perspective of the government, seeing it as a method of assimilation, which assumed Black inferiority and white superiority. So it was a white supremacist assimilationist policy, not dissimilar to what the United States did in terms of having Indian boarding schools and residential schools. The point was to educate the indigeneity out of, and oftentimes educate was an umbrella term for abuse, harm, both culturally and also physically, through forced labor, through physical abuse, sexual abuse, cultural trauma, all of that stuff. They had Magdalene laundry. They had laundries that were run by the nuns in Australia, which was very similar. So the object of these policies was to hopefully assimilate out the indigeneity in Australia, and if they couldn't, then they would die. Then it would die out. So generations of children were removed from their homes and families. And that is still a huge, huge reason for this over-incarceration and over-policing policy and systemic discrimination against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's just... that one is massive. I mean, we could do a whole thing on the stolen generations, but there, from what I've seen from the brief amount of study we have done, there is a massive gap in understanding from the government down, which again goes back to what we stated earlier, the problem of applying our cultural bias, our understanding of any sort of values, goals, and aspirations to people groups that don't share those. And then what happens is they're never going to measure up to those statistics, and then you start to justify policies that continue to discriminate and oppress. And so that's a snippet of the human rights issues. There's also a lot of issues, especially now with the land protection and a growing industry in Australia. So there's some articles and videos in the downstairs about mining in the bush on Aboriginal land and like protests over that as well. So now that we've gone through all of that sunshine and rainbows, let's do the history of colonization.
Shall we?
Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent of what is now Australia at least 60,000 years ago and developed complex hunter-gatherer societies and oral histories. They are the oldest living culture in the world. Been there a long time. As Kristen said, the Dutch were the first navigators to land there, led by Abel Tasman, which is where we get Tasmania. And they were the first Europeans to land in Australia in 1606. And they mapped out the western and northern coasts. They named the continent New Holland, but made no attempt to settle it. I've seen some hilarious videos about how great the Dutch were at exploring and how shit they were at colonizing.
Like, they just didn't care. Like, they just wanted to know where everything was, and then they were gonna go. Like, it's wild. It's wild. Dutch colonization is wild.
Dutch colonization is wild. They were like, oh, we found all this land and all these resources. Meh. In 1770, English Captain James Cook sailed to the east coast of Australia, and we know the Brits are way better at colonization.
They had whole systems. I mean, they're still keeping them going.
There's a lot of it. And named the area New South Wales, and claimed it for Great Britain, operating on the principle of terra nullius, which is a Latin term that means land belonging to no one. Terra nullius wasn't officially overturned in legal Australian documentation until the year of our Lord 1993. And just in case you're unclear about this, the implication was that the land that they were on, because there weren't white people on it, it belonged to no one.
It belonged to no one.
The land was, at that stage,
quite belongs to many people.
Aboriginal land for, I don't know, 50,000 years, give or take. Give or take. I'm not good at maths, but tens of thousands of years. So in 1788 and 1825, Great Britain established New South Wales and then Tasmania as penal colonies. It's a huge part of Australian history we don't have time to go into. Great Britain and Ireland sent more than 150,000 convicts to Australia before ending the practice in 1868. And then non-convict Europeans began settling the areas and colonizing and assimilating. They cleared the land for agriculture, which obviously impacted Aboriginal Australians' use of their land and ways of life. All of those issues, along with the disease and the colonizers, the policies, meant that by the 1900s, they started forcibly removing Aboriginal children from their parents, and they reduced the Aboriginal Australian population from more than 700,000 pre-contact to 74,000 by 1933. So it's really quite remarkable that they've managed to get up to higher than their pre-contact numbers within the 20th century. But that shows you so starkly the legacy of colonization.
And we should say too, it's the reasons that so many people died was the same reasons that so many Native Americans died. Smallpox is just the worst. Sexually transmitted diseases, it all.
Yeah.
Like anywhere white people go, they brought disease. So that's
and disease. And then just Google sometime the map of massacres in Australia.
Yeah. Oh my God.
There's a map of massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it's got a lot of dots on it. So you kill a lot of the population through massacres and disease, and then forced assimilation. And then all of these other demographic things follow from the centuries of trauma.
Yeah.
And so that's why, I left very brief demographics, because I think we can understand a lot of where the demographics would come from now in 2022 as we're filming this, based on the history of colonization, which is not dissimilar to British colonization literally everywhere. But I think it's important to remember that it was British colonization, but then the Australian government, once it was constituted, and eventually gained independence and stayed a member of the Commonwealth, continued all of those policies of colonization, which are ongoing to this day. They were granted self-government in the second half of the 1800s, and in 1901 they federated and became the Commonwealth of Australia. So you've got the entire 20th century where it's straight up Australian colonization, and settler colonialism, which are the patterns that they learned as, European British migrants and settlers. So a lot to answer for, a lot more to understand, but hopefully dipping our toes into the waters here for y'all has started your path of trying to build empathy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It certainly has for us. Dr. Kristen, what is your Jeopardy fact for the day to wrap up our coverage?
Well, one of the things, as you know, and our viewers might not know, that I am fascinated about around the world is grieving practices. It's just one of the things I'm constantly wondering how people embody their grief. And so I really loved learning that one of the ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people embody their grief is this belief that for 1 to 5 years after somebody dies, about that you don't say their name. And there was a great article I read about how, this is why the Australian Broadcasting Company has, standards and practices for historical footage. And I was just thinking, my God, if the BBC would do that, it's just wild. Or if I don't know if any First Nations or Indigenous Native Americans want this, but I can't imagine ABC, our ABC or NBC or CBS or Fox agreeing to do this.
For literally every video.
Every video.
Yeah.
So I was really, really grateful to see that that's where that came from, and I'm sure it was the product of a lot of lobbying. And I read some people for whom this is part of a theological practice, as I already mentioned, and for other people it is less tied to theology as it is just a grieving process entirely. It seems to vary from group to group, as all things do. So that's mine, is that before you watch any video with historical footage in our downstairs, you're going to hear the phrase, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this contains images and voices of people who have since passed. Something like that. So I really loved that.
I know, it was one of the things you and I both noticed as we started doing research, and we're like, what is the explanation for this? And it shows you, I think, the potential to build empathy and understanding and respect for people's different cultural practices. I mean, it took a commitment to do it, but they've done it, and it's not hurting anyone. It's helping. Yeah. My Jeopardy fact is I really, really was shocked that there has been so much talk in Australia about reconciliation. Way more than there has been here. They've done a good bit more attempts, I should say, than the United States government, and there is no reference to Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution.
Yeah, and I watched a really fascinating video about, like, that there have been attempts to do it. And I think in
the Australian people voted it down. That's
what's wild to me, and I think important to remember. Because I think those of us who learn these things and it's new, we're like, oh, well, the only reason it's still this way is that people don't know.
Oh, no.
And that's not the case.
Yeah.
I'm
like, so how do you practice human rights for people if they're not codified? Like, yeah, for me that one was a difficult pill to swallow in light of the fact that they are the oldest living culture in the world.
Yeah. And I'm like, and in light of the fact that they're human persons and yet they have no legal, I mean, it's the same, like, women aren't legally protected in the United States Constitution. There's no mention of us.
Yeah.
At all. The 19th Amendment does not mention women. And so it was, wild.
Yeah, it's a wild one. But that's a wrap on our attempt to start a conversation about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here on Colonizer World Tour. Tomorrow, next in the playlist, if you're watching this, we will discuss our piece of art, which was a recent film called In My Blood It Runs, that is available for watch for $6 on Vimeo on demand, and the money goes to supporting organizations that are involved in the producing of the film and nonprofits that are involved in helping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So if you have the $6, please give it to them. I would rather give them the money than Jeff Bezos, so I'm glad that it was available on this platform. So join us either tomorrow or next in the playlist for our discussion of In My Blood It Runs, which, is going to be sunshine and rainbows, obviously, given the last 40 minutes we've just thrown at y'all. But we hope to see you then.
Can't wait, guys. See you then.